Russian economy is in a very poor state at the moment, and it's not going to get any better. And if the US, together with the European partners, if they pressurize Russia more, and we will continue as well with our deep strikes, which degrade Russian war machinery, Russian oil economy, and Russian ammunition depots and weapons facilities. All of this may bring Russia to the negotiating table, whether they want it or not.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot, and we're joined by former advisor to the Minister of Defence of Ukraine, Yuriy Sak. Yuriy, it's great to see you again. How are you?
Good afternoon, Kate. Thank you so much. Under the circumstances, I probably should say mustn't grumble. But the situation in Ukraine, as you know, is difficult both because of the continued Russian attacks and the nervousness now surrounding the peace process.
Yes, of course. And has there been any tangible difference to your daily life and those of your fellow Ukrainians since the latest diplomatic drive got underway to end the war?
When we first heard about the 28-point plan, which then turned to the 19-point plan, of course, we are quietly optimistic because we want this war to end. It's been almost 4 years now of destruction, death, killing, and we hope that the parties who are participating in that process now will continue in good faith, and that this will result in the cessation of hostilities first, and then hopefully an establishment of a lasting peace. But at the same time, these are mixed feelings because we understand very well who we are dealing with. And while we're optimistic, at least quietly optimistic, we're at the same time skeptical because every time there is some new development in the peace process, it is almost simultaneously accompanied by another missile and drone attack. So mixed feelings, Kate, for now.
Yes, hope, some optimism, but obviously skepticism, as you say. It must be a very exhausting to live it day by day and constantly be bombarded in your country. The latest twist in this situation at the moment is the US's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, who's been leading negotiations with the Russians, has now been caught, if the leaked recording is genuine, coaching Putin's most senior foreign policy advisor on how to appeal to Donald Trump in talks. What is your reaction to that?
On the face of it, it's part of the ordinary process. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff was entrusted by the President of the United States to facilitate the peace process. Now, apparently, he thinks that he will be able to accomplish that mission if he advises the Russian side, who are very difficult to negotiate with. But, that's me being an optimist. So he probably thinks that he will facilitate the peace process if he gives some advice as to how the Russians should speak to Donald Trump. Now, we also have to understand that Donald Trump is a president who requires a special approach. So I think, any leader from any country in the world who goes to meet with Donald Trump, either in the White House or elsewhere, they all need a bit of coaching. And we are seeing that in real time when we see these Oval Office meetings. And, that's just the reality. What we, of course, hope is that Steve Witkoff is driven only by the hope of facilitating the peace process and not by some other ulterior motives. And if I put on my skeptical hat on, I can see that as well.
And when you have that information that Steve Witkoff appears to acknowledge in that conversation that peace will only be achieved if Russia gets the Donbass and a land swap somewhere, that is obviously non-negotiable for Kyiv. Do you have your skeptical hat on there, or do you think, again, he realizes that the Russian delegation team needs to be approached in a special way, as you said, Donald Trump does too?
Our president, Mr. Zelensky, he's working 24/7. His team is working 24/7 to achieve progress in this peace process. We actually are approaching it in good faith, and at the same time, at the same time, these red lines that we have, they are not the red lines of personally President Zelensky, and this is something that all parties involved need to understand, and many already do. Because President Zelensky is a democratically elected leader of a democratic country. So when he speaks for Ukraine. And he doesn't have the flexibility or freedom, or if you like, the power to decide on these contentious issues because he represents us, all of the Ukrainian people. Um, if Ukraine was a dictatorship, then probably it would be possible for other negotiating parties to, push Zelensky to sign on some unfavorable treaty, a treaty that would not be in line with the interests of the national interests of Ukraine. But I hope everybody understands that the Ukrainian people have made up their mind. Look, we are consistently and incessantly under bombardment. There are huge power cuts. I mean, some days we have no electricity for 10 hours on end. So you can imagine that and the winter is coming. So the living conditions are deteriorating. But at the same time, if you ask any average Ukrainian in the street, whether it's in Kiev, in Lviv, or Kharkiv, are we ready to capitulate? Are we ready to give up? Are we ready to just ignore the sacrifice that has already been made and the price that has already been paid? I think you will hear everybody unanimously say that no, we are not ready to capitulate.
President Zelensky, though, supports the latest 19-point proposal, and Steve Witkoff is due to go to Moscow next week to meet President Putin. He hasn't been to Ukraine, though, has he? Does it matter?
Well, from one perspective, Donald Trump, from the purely procedural point of view, has the discretion to determine, which members of his team communicate with which side of this negotiating process. And while Steve Witkoff has went to Russia a few times already, and he's apparently in touch with the Russian leadership. At the same time, Keith Kellogg, for example, another special envoy on Ukrainian issue, has been to Ukraine many times, and lately we have seen Army Secretary Driscoll here in Kiev. So I think there is some kind of separation of powers in the Trump team, and everybody's responsible for their own track. Hopefully, bringing it together in the end. But of course, and our president said it openly, that being here physically in Ukraine changes people's perspective. I mean, we see it all the time. Anybody who arrives in Ukraine these days and sees it for themselves and hears the air raid sirens for themselves and has to actually go to a bomb shelter every time an air raid siren rings out. That changes people's attitudes, perspectives, and approach to the whole process. So, I think the invitation is open, and hopefully Steve Witkoff will at some point come to Ukraine, to Kyiv, and hopefully that will help him, uh, be on the right side of history, put it that way.
At this stage, there does not seem to be any overlap between a plan that is reasonable to the Ukrainians and one is acceptable to Vladimir Putin. So what will come of this visit to Moscow?
That's a very interesting and difficult question, Kate, because look, even if in an improbable hypothetical scenario, if Ukraine would have signed that original 28-point plan and it was presented to Russia, Russia would not have signed even on that. So what Stephen Witkoff will be bringing now to Russia is an already modified, revised, and refined peace plan, which is more in line with the national interest of Ukraine. So, of course, and in addition to that, we have already heard yesterday statements from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs who said that, look, we are not going to concede anything. We have our demand. We have, they say, our objectives of the so-called special military operation, and anything short of that will not satisfy us. So it looks like Russians continue to stick to their maximalistic, unrealistic demands. And, that means that the whole process is now in question. Mind you, Donald Trump himself has said that he will only join this process after Ukraine and Russia sign on some form of an agreement. Now, the fact that the positions of Ukraine and Russia are so irreconcilable, they're so far apart, puts this whole process, if not in danger, but raises a lot of questions.
It does sound, from what people are saying, from what Donald Trump's saying, from what's coming out of the Kremlin, that the Kremlin's preparing to reject this latest plan, and that Donald Trump is preparing to perhaps walk away from it. Do you think, though, at this stage, that the Russians can be made to negotiate in good faith, because they're unlikely to stop fighting until it's ultimately more damaging to the Kremlin to continue than to stop?
Okay, when Donald Trump was inaugurated, he openly told the world about his strategy for solving this Russian war against Ukraine. And he said that, well, he will speak to Russia and he will speak to Ukraine. If Russians are not flexible, if they don't agree, he will exert pressure on the Russians. If Ukrainians are stubborn and don't want to be flexible enough to achieve some realistic agreement, then he will exert pressure on Ukraine. So this means that the United States of America continues to have the leverage. And the fact that Russians think that it's important for them to speak to Steve Witkoff, and the fact that Russians respond very nervously every time Donald Trump makes a statement that Russia is a paper tiger or that he's considering giving Ukraine Tomahawk missiles, all of this indicates that Russia is very well aware of the leverage that the US has. And from our perspective, this peace agreement, this peace process will work only if Donald Trump goes back to his original formula, which is peace through force. And when Ukraine and the United States of America and the European partners, when we all agree that this, for example, formula, this version of peace agreement is realistic, and that everybody should agree to it. And Ukraine has shown that we will never be an obstacle to peace process. There are certain red lines, but we have already moved the goalpost. We have already been flexible enough. Then the United States of America will probably, and Donald Trump personally, will be facing not a dilemma, but a choice whether he exerts more pressure on Russia, and that results in Russia's being more willing to sit down at the negotiating table, or he abandons the process. Now, we hope that it will be the former, because Russian economy is in a very poor state at the moment, and it's not going to get any better. And, if the US, together with the European partners, if they pressurize Russia more, and we will continue as well with our deep strikes, which degrade Russian war machinery, Russian oil economy, and Russian ammunition depots and weapons facilities. All of this may bring Russia to the negotiating table, whether they want it or not.
So, are you saying then that the best case scenario right now for Kyiv is that Donald Trump walks away so that you can continue taking the fight and defending your country, putting the pressure on Russia, upping the ante, upping the sanctions, so that then Russia can be forced to negotiate? Is that your point?
Well, the point I'm making is that we understand very well that this war will end only when Russia is no longer capable of continuing this war. Now, that means that Russia has to run out of resources. They have millions of people, and they have no regard for human life. So, people and manpower will never be Russian problem. But the money that they need to fund their war effort could dry up. And this is where we should be looking at. We should agree between ourselves, between the Ukraine and our partners, that this is the formula that is workable, sensible, and reasonable, and it will ensure lasting peace, and it will guarantee that Russia doesn't reinvade Ukraine at some point in the future. and then we need to force Russia to sit down and sign it.
So, a few days ago, Donald Trump had threatened to withdraw intelligence sharing and weapons to Ukraine. It hasn't happened. To the point that you've just been making, does Ukraine have to prepare to fight on without US support? And also, how do you fill the gaps?
We hope we won't be faced with that dilemma because our troops are heavily dependent on the intelligence data. Our air defense systems are dependent on the data that we receive from our US partners, as well as from NATO countries. So let's hope that when Donald Trump brings up these leverages that he says he might use against Ukraine, that he's just using that as part of the negotiating tactics. And again, we have demonstrated and we have proven that we approach the peace process in good faith and we're serious about our intentions to end the war. Russia, on the contrary, just continues to demonstrate every day that they are not interested in peace. So, point number one, we hope that it will not come to this. We will not be cut off from the intelligence data and other forms of support from the US. But of course, at the same time, sometime towards the end of 2023, when we were facing shortages of everything, of ammunition, of drones, we came to a conclusion that Ukraine must begin to become self-sufficient as much as it's possible. This is why Ukraine's defense industry now, as you might know as well, Ukraine's defense industry has grown 35 times since 2022. 40% or even more of the weapons used today by the Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are Ukrainian produced. Ukraine has become a gold standard for modern warfare and drone systems, both land drones, aerial drones, deep strike drones, naval drones. So in many respects, you want peace, you have to prepare for war. So we are moving towards self-sufficiency, but of course we're not 100% there yet. This is why we still rely on our partners, and this is why we will do everything that we have to preserve the United States as our strategic partner.
And do you think Ukraine's European allies have been robust enough in their practical and their political support so far? Could they be doing more to help you both on the battlefield, but also to have a leading role in negotiations?
The European partners have been actually great when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And we have seen last week their immediate reaction to the 28-point peace plan. And, immediately the coalition of the willing gathered and they discussed options and they came up with this alternative version of the peace plan. And they continue to provide Ukraine with military support through a variety of different channels. So we are very grateful to our European partners and in particular to the United Kingdom for standing shoulder to shoulder with us. I would also like to add that these days there is a lot of partnership and cooperation between Ukraine's defense industry and the European defense industry. So European weapons producers are localizing their production facilities in Ukraine. They create joint ventures with the leading Ukrainian drone producers. And actually just today we have seen that our president announced that the United Kingdom will now provide their facilities to produce thousands of interceptor drones for Ukraine. So there are many things that are happening and we are grateful for them. Now, whether it's happening fast enough, look, a mindset of a country at war differs from that of a country which is at peace. And thankfully, all of our European partners are at peace. But of course, we also have seen the incursions of, for example, of Russian drones into the European airspace. So while there is no war on the European terrain, at the same time, there are first signs that it can spill over. I think the realization of this threat makes our European partners move faster in many respects. We are open and we are, willing to help streamline, these processes as much as possible. And of course, we will all be now in an era where our defense industries will have to pick up pace because Russia continues to ramp up their military production. Russia is producing huge numbers of missiles, drones, and all of this means that we have to join forces. I mean, Ukraine and our European partners to ensure that we are prepared for any eventuality in the future.
Can I just pick up on that 28-point plan that was leaked last week, the plan that was devised between Steve Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev? What do you think was behind it, the timing and the intention?
The announcement or the publication or the leak of that original draft of the 28-point peace plan coincided with the problems that emerged here in Ukraine, which are connected to the high-level corruption allegations. So while I would want to refrain from being conspiratorial and speculating, at the same time, was it a coincidence, or maybe somebody thought that Ukraine's leadership now is in a weak position, so this might be a good time to try again to push this unacceptable peace offer to the Ukrainians because they are now vulnerable, weak, and they will be more agreeable. But that's just speculation. The reality is that we have seen it very quickly. That even if this was the intention, it immediately faced backlash from the European countries. It immediately, received adequate response from the Ukrainian leadership. So, but on the positive side, it restarted the peace process, which was stalled for some time. So we're back to at least talking about it for now.
And what went through your mind a week ago when that 28-point plan emerged?
Well, actually, the first thought that crossed my mind, which I'm sure was similar in the case of millions of Ukrainians, is why try again to do something which have been tried before and it's not worked. So it was so obvious. Like when we saw these requirements, you don't need to be a Ukrainian politician or a military commander to understand that the things that were being proposed are not acceptable in many ways. And look, one thing I'm afraid not everybody understands is this. Let's say there was a provision in that 28-point plan according to which Russia will get parts of the Donbas region which are currently under Ukraine's control. So Russia, being a paper tiger, wants to win this war on paper because they are unable to achieve their objectives militarily. So they are cheekily hoping to get an important part of Ukraine's stronghold in the Donbas area just with the sign of with the signature on a peace plan. And what Ukrainians understand when they see a provision like this is the following. We have seen time and again what happens to those Ukrainians' towns and villages which are occupied by the Russians. Destruction, arbitrary executions, pillaging, and the full spectrum of war crimes. So when we are proposed to give up part of Ukraine, which is inhabited by Ukrainian people, we would all feel traitors if we just gave those Ukrainian people, our brothers and sisters, to Russia, because we know what fate will await them. So there are many ways, deeper ways, in which we can explain why these conditions are unacceptable to us. But on the highest level, we are confident that it is not just Ukraine for whom this is unacceptable. Because if some form of an unjust peace agreement is signed, it will become an appeasement agreement, not a peace agreement. It will reward the aggressor, and it will send a very bad signal across the world. And if, for example, the United States of America are rightfully and seriously concerned about the stability in the Indo-Pacific region, guess what? There are actors in that part of the world watching very closely how the Ukrainian situation will be resolved. And the outcome will impact on how they will act in the Indo-Pacific. So it is in the interest of everybody to ensure that the peace, when it is achieved in Ukraine, is just and it doesn't reward the aggressor.
And when you wondered just a couple of minutes ago about the timing of that 28-point plan and the problems that Kyiv was facing, the Zelensky government was facing at the time, this multi-million-dollar corruption scandal in its energy sector. 2 ministers have been sacked and investigations underway. Do you think President Zelensky is now safe a week on?
Ukrainian people, Kate, are a very wise people. And we have very sophisticated inbuilt internal compasses which tell us when to respond to the inadequate actions of our leadership. What we saw in President Zelensky's reaction and response to that corruption scandal was a response of a leader who, when he was elected, he said that he will fight corruption. And when these allegations saw the public light, he didn't cover up. He didn't try to somehow justify those people who were on those corruption tapes. Like you said, two ministers were sacked. They're now under investigation. Other persons who were involved in those scandals and who are investigated, some have fled Ukraine and they have had sanctions imposed on them. So we here in Ukraine, we understand that corruption is a big problem, but for as long as corruption is detected and properly responded to, I think we are on the right track. And one thing that that situation demonstrated is that today in Ukraine, there is an efficient system of anti-corruption bodies who are capable of dealing with corruption at the highest level.
And yet there had been calls, hadn't there, for his Zelensky's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, and Rustem Umerov, another top official, to resign over this scandal. But they were appointed to lead the recent peace negotiations in Geneva on the US-backed plan. I mean, is the current approval rating good for the leadership team? Is it in a good state at the moment?
It's a sensitive question, Kate, but we want to live in a country governed by the rule of law. And one of the cornerstone principles of any democratic system based on the rule of law is that if there is evidence, then people have to be brought to account. Everybody who was somehow implicated and exposed in that corruption scandal is already being brought to account and will be held responsible. So we must not forget that we are still fighting a war. There's a very complex peace process in motion. So acting emotionally and irrationally without any basis in evidence and facts would not be productive. This is why, our president recorded that emergency statement where we called on the nation to be united. And I will repeat, Ukrainian people are a very wise people. We have internal safeguards against large-scale corruption and any abuse of power. So for now, it's good that these allegations are being investigated. It's good that peace process is ongoing. And, it's a dynamic situation. We'll see what happens next. But for now, I think it's tense. But we have, and President personally was able to navigate through this situation in such a way that he did not jeopardize the peace process on the one hand, yet he adequately responded to the corruption problems on the other.
And you told Times Radio a couple of days ago that you believe the war will still be going on this time next year. Has anything changed your mind?
Kate, in 2022, when I attended one of the first business conference that was organized and held in Kyiv, after the large-scale invasion began, one prominent Ukrainian businessman who is currently one of the key producers of actually drones, interestingly enough, when he was asked about how his business is coping with the new reality, he responded in the following way. He said, "We are planning everything to be stable, to be predictable. We are planning everything as if this war will last forever." So, we need to be prepared for this war to last longer, because any heightened expectations result in more disappointment and the decrease in their morale. So if we are realistic, if we look at everything that we have discussed with you, if we look at the Russian intentions, which, let's be honest, Russia wants to destroy Ukraine. Russia wants Ukraine's statehood to be demolished. Russia wants to spread its influence further west into Europe. So if we look at all of these components of this complex process that we are in, it is very difficult to predict a quick resolution. And that's why we have to brace ourselves for another difficult year ahead. And when I say that we, I mean both Ukrainians and our partners. But our strength is in our unity, and this is the most lethal weapon that Russians are afraid of. The unity of the Western world. For as long as we are united, they understand that this is an unwinnable war for them, and they stand no chance at winning.
And just finally, on a personal note, how are you preparing to face the war ahead, both mentally and practically?
Well, practically, where I reside, I have different gadgets that will allow me to go without electricity for at least 24 hours. Alternative sources of energy. But on a serious note. We are in a survival mode, and we understand that to survive, we have to be adaptable. I mean, all of us. And I'm not worried about myself. I'm worried about families with smaller children. It's going to be tough for them. This winter will be tough for them. I'm worried about the elderly across Ukraine. So it's tough. It's tough, and we tell ourselves that we are resilient, and we are. But again, referring back to President Zelensky emergency video appeal, he said when he spoke to our international partners, he said that, well, yes, Ukrainians are made of steel, but any steel can break at some point. So, and I think Europeans understand that, and I think that's partly why they are so strongly supporting us, because God forbid if Ukraine falls, we know who's going to be next.
Yuriy Sak, it's been so good talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate.
Yuriy, it's been great speaking to you. And I just wanted to tell our audience that although this interview is going to look perfect without any problems when it's actually transmitted, that during this interview, we'd had to stop and start several times because of the power or the internet outages that you've suffered. So thank you for your determination to keep talking to us on this occasion.
Thank you, Kate. We will win.
Thank you. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.